Get out now, you filthy animal. The slap landed before anyone on that plane could breathe, before anyone could turn their head or form a thought or decide whether what they were hearing was real, and the sound of it, a grown woman's open palm connecting with the face of a 6-year-old girl, cut through the pressurized cabin the way a crack of wood cuts through a quiet room, sharp and final and impossible to unhear. Little Zoe didn't even have time to flinch. 1 second she was standing in the narrow aisle of the private jet holding Admiral, her stuffed elephant. The gray velvet one she had named 3 hours ago with complete seriousness. Because as she had explained to her mother, elephants deserved important titles. And the next second her small body was crumpling sideways against her mother's arm. Her cheek already burning red, her eyes wide with a shock so total it hadn't yet become pain. The woman who did it didn't look down. She didn't look at Zoe at all. She straightened the lapel of her cream-colored blazer with the unhurried precision of someone adjusting a picture frame, tossed her platinum blonde hair back from her shoulder with a small, practiced movement, and said it loud enough for every person in that cabin to absorb every syllable. "Get out now, you filthy animal," in a voice that carried no heat, no loss of control. Nothing that could be mistaken for a moment of weakness, because it wasn't weakness that had moved her hand. It was something colder and more deliberate than that. Nobody moved. Nobody said a single word. The 2 businessmen near the front had stopped their conversation mid-syllable. The retired woman in row 4 had her paperback open in her lap, but her eyes had gone to the aisle and stayed there. The young assistant near the front of the cabin had dropped his gaze to his knees, with the speed of a man who had learned that the safest place to look in moments like this was somewhere other than at the person who had caused them. The cabin held its breath in the way that cabins hold their breath when something has happened that cannot be taken back, when the air itself seems to thicken with the weight of what has just been witnessed. And nobody, not one of the 14 people on that aircraft, had any idea what was about to happen next. Zoe hadn't cried yet. The shock was still moving through her small body, still working its way from the sting in her cheek to the part of her brain that knew what to do with pain. And in that suspended moment, in the 4 seconds of absolute silence that followed the sound of the slap and the woman's words, she pressed Admiral against her chest with both arms and lifted her face from her mother's shoulder. Her cheek was red. There were tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes, not yet falling, just gathering, and she was trembling in the way small children trembled when something happened to them that their bodies understood before their minds did. But she looked at the woman directly without flinching, with the grave and steady regard of a child who had not yet learned to make herself smaller in the face of something frightening. And she said 4 words in a voice that was both very small and impossibly clear. "My dad owns this plane. If you believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity, that no 6-year-old should ever be called an animal in the space she is supposed to be safe, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, because we want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where this day began, and let's understand exactly what that woman on that plane didn't know when she raised her hand. 40 minutes before Diana Cole's palm connected with Zoe's cheek, before anyone on that aircraft had any reason to think the flight would be anything other than unremarkable. Naomi Reed and her daughter moved through the private terminal at JFK with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before and had long since stopped finding it remarkable themselves. Zoe walked slightly ahead, Admiral tucked under one arm, her small rolling bag trailing behind her on its wheels, her attention divided between the floor, which had an interesting pattern she was apparently memorizing, and the large windows that looked out onto the tarmac where the aircraft sat gleaming in the late morning sun, with its tail visible from here, and on that tail, if you knew what you were looking for, a registration number, and below it, in clean professional lettering, Reed Aviation Group. Zoe didn't know what she was looking for. She was 6. She was looking at the plane the way 6-year-olds looked at planes, as something large and magnificent that was about to take her to her father. The ground crew member at the entrance to the jet bridge was a man named Frank, who had worked this terminal for 11 years, and who glanced at the manifest on his tablet when he saw them approaching, then looked up at Naomi, and something in his posture shifted by a fraction. A slight straightening, a subtle recalibration of attention before he held the door open with a quiet, "Good morning, Mrs. Reed," that Naomi acknowledged with an equally quiet nod and no particular acknowledgement of his deference, because she was used to it, because this was simply how things worked when you were the wife of Calvin Reed and traveling on one of his aircraft. Naomi's phone buzzed as they crossed the jet bridge, and she glanced at the screen, a text from Calvin sent from Los Angeles, where he had been since Tuesday. "Tell Zoe the elephant has a name now. I'll explain when you land. Also, don't let her pack too much for the hangar visit. She always overpacks for hangars." Naomi's mouth curved, and she looked at Zoe, who was walking ahead and hadn't seen the message. "Admiral," Naomi said. Zoe stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at the elephant under her arm, then back at her mother, then at the elephant again, with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected. "Admiral," she repeated with the gravity of a formal decision being made. "He looks like an admiral." And she walked on satisfied, the matter settled. Naomi tucked her phone back into her bag, and as she did, her lock screen was briefly visible, a photograph of Calvin standing at a podium in front of a hangar, one of his with 3 large aircraft behind him bearing the Reed Aviation logo and his name on the tails. His expression calm and focused, the expression of a man who had built something and knew its dimensions exactly. The photo was 2 years old. Nobody on the plane they were about to board had seen it. Nobody on that plane had any idea yet of the precise nature of what they were walking into. Diana Cole arrived at the gate 18 minutes after every other passenger had boarded, which was for Diana Cole entirely on schedule, because Diana Cole's schedule was organized around the premise that waiting was something that happened to other people. She came down the jet bridge escorted by her assistant Brett, who was 29 years old and had been working for the Cole family for 5 years and had developed over the course of those 5 years the particular physical quality of a person who had learned to occupy slightly less space than they were actually entitled to, walking half a step behind. Shoulders angled inward, eyes scanning ahead for obstacles that might need to be cleared before Diana encountered them. He did not make suggestions. He had learned early that suggestions were not what his role required. Diana herself walked slowly the way people walked when no one in their life had ever asked them to hurry up, when the concept of inconveniencing others by moving at your preferred pace had simply never been presented as a thing that required consideration. She was somewhere in her late 30s, dressed in the cream blazer over a silk blouse with the kind of effortless, expensive polish that required either an excellent stylist or an enormous amount of money, usually both. And she had platinum blonde hair worn loose past her shoulders and a rhinestone phone case in her left hand, and cold blue eyes that moved across the cabin as she boarded with the assessing efficiency of someone taking inventory. Her gaze passed over Naomi and Zoe, who were seated toward the rear. Zoe already at the window with Admiral arranged carefully on the seat beside her in the way that a person's gaze passed over furniture registering presence without registering personhood, noting that the space was occupied without attaching any particular significance to by whom. She settled herself into a wide seat near the front with the body language of a person who had never been asked to share space with anyone, arranging her things, a cashmere travel pillow, a leather tote. A second phone in a plain case that she set face down on the armrest with the focused attention of someone constructing a small private territory. Claire, the flight attendant, had not finished the safety introduction when Diana looked up and said without preamble and without looking directly at Claire Stillwater, "Not a question, not please." Just the words delivered with the flat expectation of a person accustomed to words being sufficient. Claire was 34 years old and had been working private charters for 6 years, and had long since mastered the art of responding to exactly this sort of person with the smooth professional neutrality that made her very good at her job. She produced the water, set it down, and disappeared back toward the galley with no visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction, though no one was watching closely enough to read it. Naomi had clocked every moment of Diana's arrival from her peripheral vision, the way mothers clocked things they didn't fully trust but didn't yet have reason to address. She turned back to Zoe, who had fallen asleep with Admiral tucked under her chin, and she adjusted the small blanket over her daughter's lap, and she thought nothing in particular about the platinum blonde woman near the front because there was nothing in particular yet to think. An hour into the flight, somewhere over the middle of the country, where the land below was flat and dark, and the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that existed at cruising altitude, and nowhere else, Zoe woke up. She woke the way she always woke, not gradually, but all at once, eyes open and oriented body already in motion before the waking was fully complete, and she tugged at Naomi's sleeve with small, urgent fingers and said in the whisper she used when she decided this was a quiet situation, Mommy, "I need the bathroom." Naomi started to stand, the instinctive movement of a mother who had been accompanying her daughter to bathrooms in airports and restaurants and airplanes for 6 years, and expected to be doing so for several more. But Zoe was already unbuckling herself, already sliding out of the seat with the decisive independence of a child who had recently and firmly decided she was old enough to manage certain things without assistance. She had said so approximately 42 times in the past month. "I can go by myself," Zoe said, gathering Admiral. "I know you can," Naomi said, which was what she always said, and she stood anyway because that was what mothers did, and Zoe was already 3 steps ahead of her in the narrow passage between the seats, walking with the focused gravity of a person on a mission. Admiral dangling from one hand, sure-footed and small and paying careful attention to the aisle numbers as she passed them. That was when Diana Cole stood up. She emerged from her seat without looking around, first the way people emerged from seats when the habit of checking whether anyone else occupied the space around you had never been formed, when the assumption had always been that the space would accommodate you rather than the other way around. She was heading toward the rear of the cabin, the lounge area, the additional seating, whatever had drawn her attention, and she stepped directly into the narrow aisle at the precise moment Zoe was passing. Zoe stopped. She looked up. Diana looked down. For one moment it was simply that a child and a woman occupying the same narrow corridor of a private jet. A logistical coincidence that resolved itself 100 times a day on planes and in grocery store aisles and on sidewalks all over the world when 2 people encountered each other and one or both of them made a small adjustment and moved on. Diana didn't move. She looked at Zoe the way she looked at minor inconveniences, a smudge on a window, a chip on a plate, and said with a flatness that was almost impressive in its emptiness, "Move." Zoe was 6 years old, and she had just woken up from a nap, and she was holding her elephant, and she needed the bathroom, and she was not in this particular moment processing the specific register of contempt that Diana's voice was carrying at the speed Diana apparently expected her to. She didn't move immediately, not because she was defiant, but because she was 6, and 6-year-olds did not move at the speed of adult impatience. "I said move," Diana repeated, and the second word landed differently than the first, with a weight behind it that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with something much older and uglier than a scheduling conflict in a narrow aisle. Zoe registered the urgency and started to step aside, but the aisle was narrow and Admiral was dangling out from her hand, and she was half a second too slow, and Diana Hartwell, who had never once in her entire life been asked to wait for anything or anyone, made a sound of pure contempt in the back of her throat. A short, sharp exhale that contained an entire worldview and reached out and shoved Zoe's shoulder. Not a nudge. A shove hard enough that Zoe stumbled sideways into the seat beside her, and her shoulder connected with the armrest with a dull thud that Naomi heard from 3 steps back, like a sound inside her own chest. Naomi was already moving. "Hey!" The word came out before it could be shaped into anything more composed or strategic, raw and immediate, the first word of a mother whose child has just been put hands on. "Don't touch my daughter." Diana turned and looked at Naomi with an expression that was somehow worse than anger, worse than cruelty that came from losing control, because it was neither of those things. It was the expression of a person who found the very premise of being addressed by Naomi faintly absurd, as if Naomi had spoken in a language Diana hadn't known was still in use. What followed was an escalation that had its own terrible logic, each stage feeding the next, each of Diana's words stripping away another layer of the polite surface, until what was underneath was fully visible to everyone in the cabin. The word obstacle, the phrase "you're kind," the pivot to her father's name and the number of aircraft he owned, and the implication delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had never once been wrong about the hierarchy of a room, that Naomi and Zoe were passengers by some kind of administrative error that she intended to correct. And then Naomi said, "Don't," one word low and fierce, and Diana's hand came back and came forward, and the sound cracked through the pressurized cabin like a shot. Zoe's head snapped sideways. The silence that followed was the worst kind of silence, the kind full of other people's horror compressed and unable to find an exit. And then Zoe lifted her face, cheek burning red. Admiral bent nearly in half from the grip of her arms. Tears streaming freely now, and she looked at Diana Cole with those wide, dark, clear eyes, and she said it. "My dad owns this plane." Naomi Reed, born Naomi Carter, had grown up in Baltimore, in a brick row house 3 blocks from the elementary school where her mother worked as the librarian and her father drove to his civil engineering job every morning, in a car he maintained himself because he said it was important to understand the things that carried you. She had been a serious child, the kind who read the backs of cereal boxes and remembered everything and asked the kind of questions that teachers either loved or found exhausting, depending on how secure they were in their knowledge. And she had grown up in the particular way that serious black girls grew up in America, which was to say, she had grown up absorbing lessons that nobody ever officially acknowledged were being taught. She had learned them the way most black women learned them, not from a textbook, not from a single dramatic incident she could point to and say that was the moment, but from the slow grinding accumulation of smaller moments that arrived without fanfare and departed without resolution. The glances that lasted a half-second too long in rooms that had expected someone different when the door opened. The polite smiles that were all shape and no warmth that never quite reached the eyes of the people wearing them. The day in 8th grade when a substitute teacher had taken attendance and upon reaching her name had looked up at the class and said, "Naomi Carter, is that right?" with an inflection that meant, "Are you sure?" The day in her sophomore year of college when she had sat down in the front row of her advanced thermodynamics class, and the professor had paused mid-sentence and looked at her in a way that asked a question he didn't say out loud. She had learned to meet all of it with her shoulders back and her chin level and her face composed into the particular expression that her mother had taught her, not through instructions but through demonstration. The expression that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I am not going to give you the reaction you're waiting for." An expression that took considerable energy to maintain, and that nobody who had never needed to use it could fully understand the cost of. She had carried that expression through the mechanical engineering program at Johns Hopkins, where she graduated second in her class. She had carried it through her first job at an aerospace firm in Virginia, where she was the only black woman in her department for 4 of the 6 years she worked there, and where she had learned to document everything, to speak with precision, to build a record of her work that was so complete and so irrefutable that the only way to ignore it was to decide you had decided to ignore it before she walked in the room, which some people had, and which she had learned to identify early and root around with the efficient calm of an engineer solving a problem she had solved before. She had carried it to the FAA, where she ran her division within 6 years, and where she had left on her own terms to consult privately for aerospace infrastructure companies, which was where she was now, or rather where she was between flights, between meetings, between the work that had always felt like the most honest version of herself and the life she had built around it. Calvin Reed had met her at an industry conference in Houston 7 years ago, and had fallen in love, as he had described it to his closest friend, with the fact that she had stood up at a panel discussion and corrected the moderator's statistics in front of 400 people, without raising her voice, without apology, without any particular regard for whether the moderator found the correction welcome, and with a precision that was so complete it simply wasn't arguable. Calvin had introduced himself afterward. Naomi had shaken his hand and said with the same even delivery she used for everything, "Your company's maintenance contracts on the Eastern Corridor are underpriced. You should fix that before your competitors notice." He had gone back to his hotel room that night and fixed them. Then he had called her, and they had talked for 2 hours about structural load tolerances and industry bias and what it meant to build something that lasted, and somewhere in that conversation, he had understood that he was not going to be able to stop talking to this woman for the rest of his life. And he had been right. Calvin Reed had grown up in Atlanta in a house where the garage was always open and always smelled like engine grease and burned coffee because his father, a man named Joseph Reed, worked on aircraft for 30 years and believed that a man's understanding of the things he touched was the only credential that couldn't be taken from him. Joseph Reed had spent 3 decades working on planes that took other families to places his family had never been, to business meetings in cities they had only seen on television, to vacations in countries they had only read about, to the kinds of destinations that required first-class seats and platinum membership cards and the easy assumption that the world would accommodate you when you arrived. He had maintained those planes with the careful attention of someone who understood that the difference between excellence and carelessness in his work was measured in lives, and he had been paid a wage that reflected none of that understanding. And he had gone home every night to a house where the heat was sometimes insufficient, and the car sometimes needed work. He couldn't afford, and his son watched all of this with the attentiveness of a child who was building a theory of the world. Calvin's theory, formed slowly over the years he spent watching his father, was not about bitterness because Joseph Reed was not a bitter man and did not raise a bitter son. The theory was simpler and more actionable than that. The gap between the people who built and maintained the things and the people who owned and traveled on the things was not natural. It was constructed, and constructed things could be reconstructed differently. Calvin had no inheritance. He had no network in the traditional sense, no family friend who made the call, no alumni connection who opened the door, no name that preceded him into rooms and smoothed his path. What he had was a mechanical engineering degree from Georgia Tech, a maintenance contract he had identified through careful research of his father's employer's books, a small business loan from a community bank whose loan officer had told him he was taking a risk on him, and a quality of attention to his work that was over time irrefutable. Reed Aviation Group had grown from that single contract over 15 years, in the way that things grew when the person building them understood every component from the ground up, not in dramatic leaps but in steady compounding increments. Each piece of the business understood and mastered before the next was added. Each relationship built on the foundation of work that was simply and consistently better than anyone had expected. By the time Naomi met him, he had 7 aircraft registered in his name and 230 employees. By now, it was 14 aircraft, 3 terminals, and a company whose reputation in private charter management was quiet and absolute in the way that only reputation earned entirely through performance ever was. Calvin did not announce himself. He had learned from watching Joseph that announcements were for people who needed to compensate for a gap between what they claimed and what they had actually built, and he had no gap to compensate for. When he walked into rooms, he let the rooms figure out for themselves what they were dealing with, and they always did. Eventually, though, sometimes it took longer than it should have, and that delay, the extra time required before certain rooms recognized him. The particular quality of the pause before certain handshakes were extended was something he had made his peace with a long time ago, the way his father had made peace with it, without letting it become the center of the story he was telling about himself. The charter service Diana Cole was currently flying on was one of Calvin's. The aircraft she had boarded with her rhinestone phone case and her cream blazer and her platinum blonde hair, and her absolute certainty that the hierarchy of this particular space was hers to define. That aircraft had Calvin Reed's name in its registration documentation, his maintenance team's hands in its mechanical history, and his operations manager's signature on every flight clearance it had ever received. Calvin was in Los Angeles right now in a glass-walled meeting room on the 32nd floor of a building in Century City, closing a deal that had taken 8 months to negotiate, and that would add 2 additional aircraft to the Reed fleet, and a maintenance contract for a regional carrier that his operations team had been working toward for 2 years. His phone had been buzzing with updates every 90 minutes. He had not yet seen the text from Naomi because the meeting had required his full attention, and Calvin Reed, when something required his full attention, gave it completely. That was about to change. Zoe Reed was 6 years old and possessed, in the assessment of everyone who knew her, a quality that was difficult to name precisely and impossible to miss, a kind of stillness behind her attention that made you feel, when she was watching you, that she was not just seeing you but cataloging you, building a file, deciding something about you that she would act on when the time was right. She had her father's capacity for sustained focus, and her mother's spine, both of them resident in a small body that had recently decided it was old enough to have opinions about how it was managed, and those opinions were expressed not through tantrums or drama, but through the same steady factual delivery that Naomi used for everything, as if Zoe had understood from early on that the most effective way to make a point was to make it clearly. She loved Strawberry Lemonade and picture books about ocean animals, particularly the ones with detailed cross-sections showing what creatures looked like inside, and she had a habit which both her parents found simultaneously exhausting and deeply endearing of assigning titles to the things she loved. The stuffed elephant was Admiral now. The houseplant in the living room of the Los Angeles house was General. The small orange fish in the tank in her bedroom in New York was Captain, and the captain had held his rank for 14 months without demotion, which was, Naomi had noted, a more stable leadership tenure than most of the executives she had consulted for. When Zoe met new people, she studied them first at length and without self-consciousness, with the focused attention of a researcher gathering data. And then she decided, based on criteria, she did not fully articulate how much of herself she was going to give them. Some people got the full version of Zoe immediately, the observations and questions, and the frank assessments and the laugh that took over her whole face. Others waited. She did not explain the distinction and could not be hurried past it. This trip was a significant one in the calendar of Zoe's life, and she had been aware of its significance since the night Calvin had called from Los Angeles and told her that when she landed, he was going to take her to the hangar and show her the new aircraft, and she could stand in the cargo bay and see how large it was. Zoe had requested at that point that Admiral be informed of the upcoming journey, and Calvin had solemnly agreed to pass the information, along which was the text Naomi had received on the jet bridge. "Tell Zoe the elephant has a name now. I'll explain when you land the result of a conversation between a 44-year-old man and a stuffed animal that had been conducted apparently with complete seriousness on both sides." Zoe had been awake since 4:30 that morning, with anticipation, and she had been asleep for 40 minutes on the plane with Admiral in the crook of her arm, and her father's voice in her head saying, as he always said when she was traveling to meet him, "I'll be there. Don't let Mom be late." She had not been late. And now she had said something in a voice small enough to fit inside the silence of a stunned cabin that was about to bring her father faster than either of them had planned. The first hour of the flight had been, by every measure available, entirely ordinary. Claire had done the safety demonstration to an audience of 14 passengers in various states of pre-flight distraction, laptops, open earbuds, inserted phones, doing the last frantic work of checking messages before airplane mode, and had then moved efficiently through the cabin, taking drink orders and stowing the last of the overhead luggage, and performing the 100 small tasks that composed the pre-flight ritual of a well-run private charter. She was good at this work, good in the specific way that came from genuine attention to the craft, rather than performance of it, and she moved through the cabin with the practiced economy of someone who understood exactly what the space required. Naomi had settled Zoe at the window seat before anyone else was fully organized, arranging Admiral in the position Zoe specified, seated upright trunk, visible facing forward, so he could see where they were going, and producing the juice box and the small bag of pretzels and the coloring book that Zoe had selected for travel from the basket she kept in her bedroom, for exactly this purpose. These were the rituals of many flights, refined over 3 years of traveling with a child who had opinions about the order of things, and Naomi moved through them the way she moved through everything that had been done enough times to become fluent efficiently with half her attention already elsewhere. She had opened Calvin's most recent email and begun to read it when Zoe fell asleep, which happened 12 minutes after takeoff, quickly and completely, in the way Zoe always fell asleep when she had been awake since 4:30. Admiral clutched to her chest, head tipping toward the window, a small sigh of surrender, and then gone with the spectacular absence of self-consciousness that children brought to sleep and that adults spent years trying to recover. Calvin's email was long and detailed and characteristically precise. He was describing a structural issue he had identified in the new hangar's loading bay configuration, a problem with the weight distribution of the ceiling supports that his construction team had missed and that he had caught on a walkthrough that morning, and he wanted Naomi's opinion on the engineering solution before he approved the contractor's proposed fix, because he trusted her assessment more than the contractor's and had learned over 7 years that this trust was consistently well placed. He described the problem in full technical detail and asked 3 specific questions, and reading it, Naomi felt the familiar mix of professional engagement and genuine warmth that his emails reliably produced the sense of being treated as a peer by the person she happened to also be in love with, which was, she had come to understand, not nearly as common as it should be. She was drafting her reply. She had an opinion on the ceiling supports, and it differed from the contractor's proposed solution in one important respect when she registered the other passengers around her, the way you registered the periphery of a room, when your central attention was elsewhere with the low-level monitoring of someone who was paying enough attention to notice if anything changed. In row 4, slightly ahead and across the aisle, the retired woman Eleanor. She would learn later, 72 years old, a former high school principal from Philadelphia, who was flying to Los Angeles for a nephew's wedding, was reading a paperback with the settled concentration of someone who had given herself permission to do nothing else for the duration of the flight. She had smiled at Zoe when they boarded, the warm, uncomplicated smile of someone who liked children without needing anything from them, and Zoe had studied her for a full 4 seconds before smiling back, which Eleanor had apparently recognized as a compliment because she had looked pleased. In 3C, the businessman Thomas, who would turn out to be the kind of person whose precise industry you never quite established, but whose familiarity with powerful people was evident in the way he received information about them, which was, without surprise, had his laptop open and was doing something on it with focused efficiency, pausing occasionally to glance out the window with the expression of a man reviewing a decision he had already made. He had nodded at Naomi when he sat down, a small collegial acknowledgement, and had not spoken since. And near the front, in her self-constructed territory of cashmere and rhinestones and careful spacing, Diana Cole had not moved, had not spoken to anyone, had consumed her still water and ordered a second one, and was now apparently reading something on her phone that required her full and occasionally irritated attention. Brett sat 3 rows behind her, scrolling his own phone with the furtive speed of someone who had learned to take his small windows of independence where he could find them. The cabin had the sound of a space where people had accepted one another's presence without yet engaging with it, the particular low-level hum of strangers in proximity laptop fans, and the recycled air system, and the distant movement of clouds outside the windows, and the white noise of altitude that softened everything slightly. Naomi was halfway through her reply about the ceiling supports when she felt the tug on her sleeve. "Mommy, I need the bathroom." She looked at Zoe, who was already awake and already moving, and the email was set aside, and the rituals of the flight's second act began, and none of what came next was going to wait. The slap landed, and the cabin froze. Not metaphorically, actually froze the way a room froze when something happened that the air itself needed a moment to process, when the collective understanding of a shared space shifted so suddenly that the people inside it lost for several seconds the ability to do anything other than absorb the fact of what had just occurred. Zoe's cry came a beat after the sound of the slap, raw and sharp and high, the specific cry of a child in shock and pain rather than just one or the other. The kind of sound that was impossible to hear without responding to it physically, that moved through Naomi's body before her brain had finished processing the sequence of events, and Naomi caught her daughter before she finished falling, arms going around her with the automatic speed of a mother who had been watching something terrible approach and had positioned herself to catch it. She could feel Zoe shaking against her. She could feel the wet heat of tears against her neck, and the small, thundering heartbeat of a child in shock, beating so fast it seemed wrong for something so small, and she could feel the particular tension in Zoe's body. That was the tension of a child who had been hurt in a way she didn't yet fully understand, by a person whose reason for hurting her she couldn't begin to parse. Diana had straightened her blazer. She had, actually, in the 3 seconds after the slap, reached up and adjusted the lapel of her cream blazer as if the slap had ruffled it rather than the other way around. And her voice, when she spoke, was completely level, not controlled level. The way a voice was level when there had been no loss of control to begin with, when what had just happened had been chosen rather than reactive. "Get out now, you filthy animal." The words hung in the pressurized air of the cabin, and nobody breathed. Eleanor, in row 4, had her phone in her hand already. She had reached for it somewhere in the middle of the escalation, not dramatically with the practiced quietness of someone who understood that the most useful thing she could do in this moment was document it rather than announce her documentation. And the camera was running. The phone held low against the armrest at an angle that caught the aisle and most of the relevant scene without requiring her to raise it visibly. Brett had his eyes on his knees. He had moved his eyes there the moment the confrontation began escalating past a certain point with the speed of a man who had made this particular calculation before the calculation about whether the cost of intervening was one he was willing to pay, and who had again decided that his position on that calculation was to look at his knees and wait for it to be over. The fact that this calculation had produced a different result than he had expected, that it had not been over, that it had proceeded to a place none of the previous incidents had reached, was registering on his face now, as something that looked to anyone watching him remarkably like shame. Thomas the businessman had stopped pretending to work. His laptop was still open in front of him, but his attention had moved entirely to the aisle, and he was watching with the careful cataloging stillness of a person who was paying precise attention and deciding what to do with what he was paying attention to. The cabin held its collective breath in the 4 seconds of absolute silence that followed Diana's words, and then Naomi's arms tightened around Zoe, and Naomi's face, which had been controlled and composed and carefully managed through the entire escalation, settled into an expression that had nothing managed about it at all. Naomi was shaking. She could feel it in her hands and in her jaw, the fine controlled tremor of someone expending enormous energy on containment rather than expression, not because she was afraid, but because she understood with the cold clarity that extreme stress sometimes produced in her exactly what the trap was and exactly what Diana Cole was waiting for. Any reaction would be weaponized. Any raised voice, any movement that could be framed as aggressive, any visible loss of composure, all of it would be captured in the memory of every person in that cabin and arranged into a narrative that Diana's lawyers and Diana's father and Diana's publicist would construct around it like scaffolding around a building they intended to keep standing. Naomi had been in enough rooms to know how these narratives got built and who got to build them, and she had made her decision in the 2 seconds between the slap and her first spoken word that Diana Cole was not going to get that narrative from her. She checked Zoe with her hands first, the instinctive maternal inventory that happened below conscious thought, fingers moving across her daughter's shoulder, her jaw turning her face gently toward the cabin light, so Naomi could see the red mark on her cheek, pressing lightly to check for anything worse than the sting that was clearly already there. Zoe winced slightly but didn't pull away. She was not crying anymore. Her eyes were wide and she was holding Admiral against her chest with both arms, and she was tracking Diana the way small children tracked things that frightened them, not looking directly, not looking away, something in between the careful peripheral attention of a creature assessing a threat. Naomi stood and put herself between Zoe and Diana. "You will not speak to her like that." Diana's response moved through its own predictable progression, the dismissal flat and immediate, as if Naomi had pointed out something both obvious and irrelevant, the pivot to authority, the assertion of her right to manage the space, and then the escalation to class, to identity, to the particular performance that Diana reached for when she needed to close a conversation by reminding the other person of the distance between them. "Do you know who I am?" The question was not rhetorical. It was tactical, delivered with the sharp precision of a weapon Diana had used before and found effective, the name that was supposed to end things, the currency that was supposed to make the rest of the conversation unnecessary. She named her father. She named the number of aircraft Gerald Cole owned. She named the implication that the space Naomi and Zoe occupied on this flight was conditional on Diana's tolerance of their presence rather than on the boarding passes in Naomi's bag or the name on the aircraft's registration. Naomi said, "Don't." One word. Low and fierce and aimed with the precision of someone who had not raised her voice because she didn't need to raise her voice because the word carried exactly as much weight as the situation required without a decibel more. And Diana's hand had come back deliberately with full intention without the excuse of impulse or the mitigation of a moment of uncontrolled anger and came forward, and the sound was what the sound was and Zoe's cry was what Zoe's cry was. And now they were here in the aftermath with the mark still visible on a 6-year-old's cheek and the silence of 14 people pressing down on all of them like weather. Claire was in the galley doorway. She had appeared there at some point during the escalation. Naomi wasn't sure exactly when, and she was standing with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged into the careful neutrality of a professional who understood that any word she said in this moment would be used by someone, that there was no neutral ground for the person wearing a uniform in a confrontation like this one, and that her most useful contribution right now was to witness it completely and do nothing that would give either side the ability to make her part of their narrative. She met Naomi's eyes for half a second. Something passed between them that was not a word and did not need to be. Zoe lifted her face from her mother's shoulder. It happened slowly, the way things happened when a child's body was moving faster than the shock that was still moving through it, a gradual shift of weight, a small uncurling from the position of pure instinct and pure pain, until her face was visible and her eyes were open, and she was looking at Diana Cole with an expression that had changed from what it had been a minute ago. The shock was still there, but it was receding, moving back like a tide pulling away from the shore, and what was replacing it was something that Naomi recognized with a particular pang of recognition that she would think about for a long time afterward. The expression she had seen on her daughter's face when Zoe was making a decision, when she was applying the internal criteria that governed what she gave people and how and when she had gathered enough information and was now drawing her conclusion. Admiral was bent nearly in half from the grip of Zoe's arms. Her cheek was still red. The tears were still on her face, not yet dried, and there were more forming, but her eyes were steady, and her jaw was set with a determination that looked in a 6-year-old's face both entirely natural and entirely extraordinary. And she looked at Diana Cole with the grave, assessing front-on regard of someone who had decided something. "My dad owns this plane." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed the slap. The one after the slap had been the silence of shock, reflexive, compressed, the silence of people who had not yet caught up with reality. This one was the silence of recalibration, the silence of people who were replaying the last 40 minutes of the flight in light of a new and significant piece of information, reassigning weights, reconsidering positions. Diana stared at Zoe with an expression that Naomi watched closely and had never quite seen before on Diana's face, because all of the contempt and dismissiveness and practiced certainty that had been present since Diana boarded the plane had for the first time been interrupted by something that resembled uncertainty. It was brief, a flicker, a micro-expression, a crack in the surface just wide enough to see what was beneath it, but it was there. Naomi's voice shifted. It was not louder, not sharper. Nothing about it escalated, but something in the quality of it changed. Some quality of solidity entering it that had not been there before, something grounded and still and completely certain of its own weight. "Her name is Zoe, and she is telling you the truth." Diana laughed. It was the short, sharp, dismissive laugh of someone who had decided that the best way to handle a situation was to make it seem too small to take seriously, a sound that contained an entire dismissal wrapped in a breath, and she said something about games, and something about this being her flight, and something about Naomi being no one whose claim required acknowledgement. And then Naomi said a name. 2 words. Nothing more. No explanation, no elaboration, no surrounding context, just Calvin Reed. I suggest you think very carefully about whether that name means anything to you before you say another word. The air in the cabin changed. It was subtle, and it was real. The way temperature changed when a cloud passed in front of the sun. The way a room changed when a door opened from an unexpected direction, and Thomas, the businessman who had been watching all of this with the quiet cataloging attention of someone who recognized certain kinds of situations, closed his laptop. Brett was on his feet before anyone expected him to be. He had been sitting with his eyes on his knees through most of the confrontation, which was the position he had developed over 5 years of employment with the Cole family. For moments like this one, moments that had a trajectory and a velocity that his involvement could not redirect. Moments that he had calculated repeatedly, and always with the same conclusion, were not his to intervene in. He had made that calculation today, and the calculation had produced its usual answer, and then the slap had happened, and the calculation had failed in a way that none of its previous iterations had prepared him for. He said her name quietly from his standing position in the aisle. Diana. Just her name. But the way he said it with the particular flat exhaustion of someone who had said it this way before in other versions of this situation and had never been listened to and was saying it now anyway, because the alternative was to continue sitting with his eyes on his knees while the day got worse, carried its own weight. Diana predictably ignored him. She was pivoting to her father again. The name the aircraft, count the implication of authority. And Brett sat back down with the expression of a man who was watching himself fail to be the person the situation required and who was going to be thinking about that for a very long time. Thomas set his water glass down. He did it with the deliberate economy of a person who had decided to enter a situation and was announcing that decision through action rather than words, and the sound of the glass on the tray table was quiet, but it was distinct in the silence that had settled over the forward section of the cabin, and Diana, who had the instinctive social radar of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where status determined everything, turned toward the sound. Thomas looked at her with the mild, almost academic interest of a man examining something that confirmed a hypothesis he had held for some time. He was somewhere in his 60s, compact and gray-haired, with the patient-contained quality of a person who had been in many rooms with many powerful people and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them, and had arrived somewhere along the way at a relationship with his own judgment that was simple and stable and not much interested in other people's approval. Calvin Reed Thomas said with the conversational tone of someone contributing a relevant fact to a discussion that had been missing its services this route. This aircraft's charter contract has been with Reed Aviation Group for 3 years. The maintenance history, the flight clearances, the registration, all of it runs through Calvin Reed's company. He picked his water glass back up and looked at Diana with the same mild attention. I'd put the phone down. Diana's hand lowered by 3 inches. Eleanor did not wait for the silence to reestablish itself after Thomas's contribution. She closed her paperback, not quickly, not with drama, just with the decisive finality of a woman who had been watching and listening and deciding and who had now decided. And she looked at Diana with the direct, clear-eyed gaze of someone who had spent 30 years in front of classrooms full of people who were trying to get away with things and who had developed over those 30 years a very accurate instrument for measuring the distance between what people claimed and what they had actually done. I have it on video, Eleanor said. Her voice was warm, and it was absolutely steady, and it contained in its warmth and its steadiness a quality of irrevocability that was somehow more serious than anger would have been. From the moment you shoved that child to right now, I have it all. Diana stared at her. Something in the architecture of her certainty, the foundational assumption that had governed the entire encounter, the assumption that there was no version of this in which she faced a real consequence, began to crack at its base. You wouldn't. I would, Eleanor said simply. I already did. Naomi reached for her phone. Her hands were steady. She pressed Calvin's name and listened to the line ring once, twice, and then his voice came through unhurried and low, with the particular quality of a man who had trained himself to sound exactly the same regardless of what was happening, because he had learned that urgency was most effective when it looked like calm. "Hey," he said. "I was just about to call you. How's the Calvin?" Naomi said. "Something has happened and I need you to handle it." Naomi told him what had happened the way she told him everything important, without embellishment, without the dramatic scaffolding that other people built around difficult information to cushion the delivery, with the clean precision of someone who understood that facts stated in the order they occurred were more powerful than any arrangement of them, and that the person she was talking to was capable of receiving them without the cushion, the shove first. The words, the specific words, the exact ones Diana had used repeated without inflection, because the inflection was beside the point when the words themselves were what they were, the slap. And then, the mark is still on her cheek. I can see it from here. The silence that followed on Calvin's end was 3 seconds long, and anyone who did not know Calvin Reed would have heard those 3 seconds as hesitation as a man gathering himself, as shock needing a moment to settle into action. But Naomi had been listening to Calvin Reed's silences for 12 years, and she knew the difference between the silence of a man who needed a moment and the silence of a man who had already finished deciding and was simply confirming the decision against the information he had just received. This was the second kind. "Put Claire on the phone," he said. Naomi walked 3 steps to the galley doorway and held the phone out. Claire took it with both hands, the way you took something from someone when you understood the weight of the moment required that kind of care, and she listened for 25 seconds with her eyes on the middle distance and her expression professionally unchanged, and her posture doing the thing that Naomi had been watching posture do all morning, the small, precise recalibration that registered significance without displaying it. She handed the phone back to Naomi. She turned toward the cockpit. 20 seconds later, the intercom clicked on. The pilot's voice was measured in the specific way of people who delivered serious information in confined spaces for a living, not dramatic, not rushed, carrying the particular authority of someone whose instructions were not subject to discussion once stated. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience. We will be making an unscheduled landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. We expect to be on the ground within approximately 25 minutes. Diana was standing before the announcement had finished. She was in the aisle with one hand on the headrest in front of her, and her voice had a new quality in it, something that had been absent from it through the entire confrontation, through the shoves and the words and the slap and the aftermath, something that was trying not yet successfully not to be what it was. "No," she said. "No, that is, you cannot turn this aircraft around because of this is completely. Ma'am." Claire had reappeared from the direction of the cockpit with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this and had decided in advance exactly how she was going to handle it. Her voice was gentle and absolute, the particular combination that was the most unargumentable of all tonal combinations, because gentleness without absolute firmness behind it could be worn down, and firmness without gentleness gave people something to push against. But gentleness and absolute firmness together produced a surface that had no leverage for resistance. "Sit down. The pilot's instructions are final." Diana sat down. The plane banked slowly to the left, beginning its long arc back toward the east, and the city lights far below shifted and shimmered in their positions as the horizon tilted, and the businessmen in the front section had stopped pretending not to watch. And Eleanor had put her paperback down entirely, and Zoe, pressed against Naomi's side with Admiral clutched to her chest, looked up with the face of a child who had already done the calculation. "Is Daddy coming?" "Daddy's coming," Naomi said. Zoe nodded once the small, solid, completely certain nod of a 6-year-old who had never had reason to doubt this particular answer, and she leaned back against her mother's arm and closed her eyes. Naomi's phone buzzed against her knee while Zoe rested against her with her eyes closed and her breathing gradually steadying from the quick, shallow breaths of shock towards something slower and more regular, the way children's breathing steadied when the acute thing had passed and their bodies were beginning the process of returning to themselves. The text was from Calvin, 20 minutes. Don't engage her again. I'm handling it from the ground. Naomi looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "She hit our daughter Calvin." The response came in 3 seconds. "I know, 20 minutes. She put the phone face down on her knee and looked at the seat back in front of her, and thought about 20 minutes in the way she thought about all fixed quantities of time as a thing with a specific beginning and end, a thing she could get to the other side of if she just held what she was holding for the duration of it. She had held harder things together for longer. What she didn't know yet was that in the time since she had hung up with Calvin, he had already made 2 phone calls, with a third being connected at this moment. The first was to his head of security. The second was to the operations manager at JFK, where the plane was being rerouted. The third was to a man whose number Calvin kept not in his phone's main contacts, but in a separate list he labeled simply with a letter. A man whose name Naomi had heard exactly twice in their marriage, both times in the context of situations that had required a particular quality of response. Patient, methodical, complete, and both times the situations had been resolved in exactly that way. Calvin did not make that third call lightly. He made it now. Across the aisle, Diana sat in her cream blazer, with her rhinestone phone case in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, staring at the back of the seat in front of her, in the way someone stared at something that had no content, because looking at the actual content of the situation was not something she was ready to do yet. With every foot of altitude the plane shed as it descended, slow, steady, irreversible, the understanding of what had happened and what was waiting at the bottom of the descent seemed to settle over her face like something gravity-assisted, like something she could not stop with effort of will, regardless of how much effort she applied. The cabin was quiet except for the engines and the recycled air and the sound of Zoe's breathing against Naomi's shoulder. And Naomi kept her eyes straight ahead and thought about what she was going to say when they landed. Not to Diana, not to anyone on this aircraft, but to the lawyers, to the record, to the document she had already decided somewhere in the middle of the worst 5 minutes of the flight was going to exist. She was going to make sure it existed. She was going to make sure it was complete. Naomi Brooks, Naomi Reed, had spent a great deal of her adult life understanding that the most important thing in a situation like this was not to react in the moment, no matter how badly the moment demanded it, but to build with patience and precision the kind of record that outlasted the moment and could not be managed by money or connection or the name your father happened to have. She was going to build that record. She was going to start building it the moment they landed. 20 minutes. She could hold 20 minutes. The plane didn't land at a terminal. It was rerouted to a private section of the airfield, a stretch of tarmac reserved for aircraft whose owners had standing arrangements with the airport, whose maintenance and fueling and ground operations were handled through separate channels from commercial traffic, and the wheels touched down with a long, smooth shudder, and the engines reversed their thrust, and the aircraft slowed with the unhurried deceleration of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Through the window, as the plane taxied through the dark, Naomi could see 2 vehicles waiting their headlights, cutting clean parallel lines across the tarmac, illuminating a strip of wet ground that reflected the light back in doubled wobbling columns. She recognized the car on the left immediately. Not because it was distinctive, because it wasn't because Calvin had never bought cars to be distinctive, but because she had been riding in it for 4 years and knew the shape of it the way you knew the shape of anything you had spent enough time with to stop consciously noticing. He was already out of the car before the plane's door opened. She could see him through the window, tall jacket on despite the hour moving across the tarmac with the particular quality of purposeful motion that Calvin brought to everything fast enough to communicate urgency, but without the quality of running, because Calvin Reed had never needed to run to make clear that something was serious, and he had arrived to address it. He moved the way he moved through difficult board meetings, through negotiations that had gone wrong, through the situations that required the full and undivided weight of his attention, like a man who had decided where he was going and could not be deflected from it by anything that the space between here and there might choose to put in his way. Behind his car, a second vehicle sat with its engine running, and 3 people were climbing out of it. Not large people, not people who looked like security in the way. Movie security looked uniformed and conspicuous and performing the role, but people who were quiet and organized, and who positioned themselves at specific points on the tarmac without being told, and with the efficient, unhurried economy of people who had been told in advance what the situation was and had already figured out where they needed to be. The cabin door opened, Claire stepped aside, and Calvin Reed stepped in. He was 44 years old, and he had built 3 companies and navigated more difficult rooms than he could count, and had developed along the way the particular quality of arrival, the thing his father had had, and that he had inherited through proximity, rather than instruction of making his presence felt in a space not through size or volume or performance, but through a quality of settled, focused attention that the people in the space registered at some level below conscious thought and that produced in them reliably the understanding that something had shifted. He looked at Naomi first. That was the first thing he did before he looked at anything else in the cabin. Found her eyes, held them for exactly 2 seconds, a check that said, "I'm here, and I'm angry, and the anger is managed and you're safe. And I see you in the compressed language that people who had known each other for a long time developed for exactly these kinds of moments." Then he looked at Zoe. Zoe looked back at him with Admiral still pressed against her chest and her cheeks still faintly red in the cabin light, and she said it with the particular directness of a child who had decided at some point during the descent that the most important thing was to ensure the relevant party had the relevant information. "Dad, she hit me." Something moved across Calvin Reed's face. Brief controlled a thing that existed for half a second and was managed back into composure before it had fully formed, and if you had blinked in that half second, you would have missed it. But Naomi had been watching this face for 12 years, watching it in meetings and in difficult conversations, and in the quiet moments that were the real interior of a life together, and she did not miss it. She saw exactly what lived behind the composure in that half second, and she had no word for it that she was willing to say out loud, only the knowledge of its weight and its depth and what it meant about the kind of man who kept it as contained as he kept it. He crossed the cabin in 4 steps. He crouched in front of his daughter. He cupped her face in both hands with the particular gentleness of someone whose hands were used to building things, and who was now, for the moment, using them only for this. And he turned her face toward the cabin light and looked at her cheek and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at it. Then he said very quietly, in a voice that he had made steady by an effort that Naomi could read in the set of his jaw, "Are you okay, baby? It still hurts a little," Zoe said honestly. "I know it does." He pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture so practiced and so specific to the 2 of them that it required no explanation. "I'm sorry it took me this long to get here." "You came fast," Zoe said. "Admiral said you would." Calvin pulled back and looked at Admiral. Something in his expression shifted, something that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief, but was the particular combination of both that happened when love and pain occupied the same moment simultaneously. "Admiral is very smart," he said, and his voice was warm and absolutely steady and gave no indication at all of what was happening in the rest of him. He stood up. He turned around, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, he looked at Diana Cole. Diana Cole, who 40 minutes ago had been conducting herself on this aircraft as though the hierarchy of the space was hers to define and enforce, was now sitting in her cream blazer with her rhinestone phone case down on her knee and her assistant 2 rows away, and her father's name fully loaded and ready on the tip of her tongue and not being used, because something about the way Calvin Reed was looking at her had made her understand, with a clarity that was arriving later than it should have, but was arriving completely, that the name was not going to do what names usually did for her in this kind of situation. It was not the size of him. It was not the men on the tarmac. It was not any external element of the situation that had produced the fear that was now present on Diana Cole's face, actually present. Not the performance of fear she might have deployed in other circumstances as a tactical move, but the real thing, involuntary and physical. It was the way he was looking at her. Not with rage. There was no rage in it. No heat. No raised voice or visible loss of composure or any of the things that would have given her something to push back against. It was the look of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was waiting with complete patience for the appropriate moment to inform her of it. It was the look of someone who was not performing his response to the situation, but simply being it. And the difference between performance and actuality in these moments was something Diana had spent her whole life recognizing in other people and had simply never been on the wrong side of before. "Mr. Reed," she said, and her voice for the first time was not flat, not practiced, not the instrument of dismissal she had been deploying for the past hour. It was careful, precisely, careful, the voice of someone who was making conscious decisions about each word before releasing it. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding about what No Calvin said." One word, not raised, not sharp, just closed. The way. A door closed when the conversation on the other side of it was finished. Not slammed, not locked, just closed with quiet finality. Diana stopped. He told her what he knew, that he had spoken to Claire, that he had spoken to 2 other passengers who had witnessed the full sequence of events, that he had seen his daughter's cheek in the cabin light. "There is no misunderstanding about what happened on this aircraft." Diana tried justification. Zoe had been in the way. The aisle had been blocked. The situation had escalated in a way that my daughter, Calvin, said is 6 years old. He paused, and the pause was exactly as long as it needed to be, and no longer. She was carrying a stuffed elephant. Another pause. She was going to the bathroom. He said it without volume, without aggression, without the scaffolding of emphasis that people built around important statements when they needed to make the importance legible. The repetition alone was doing everything, the quiet insistence of facts, stated plainly, the refusal to let them be elaborated away or contextualized into something more manageable. He told her what was going to happen. She was going to stand up. She was going to walk to Naomi and Zoe. She was going to apologize not to Calvin, to them. "Or you can explain to 3 separate attorneys before sunrise why you struck a child on my aircraft and called her an animal. Those are the options." Brett reached over and touched Diana's arm with the lightest possible pressure, the touch of someone making a request he had no authority to make, but was making anyway, because the alternative was worse. "Diana, please." She looked at Zoe. Zoe looked back at her, those wide, dark, steady eyes, not with hatred and not with triumph, but with the clear-eyed patience of a child who was waiting to see whether an adult was going to do the right thing. Diana stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady beneath her, and she made them work anyway, which was perhaps the most honest thing Diana Cole had done in a very long time, not pretending the steadiness was there, but moving forward in the absence of it. She walked past Thomas, who did not look at her. His gaze was on the window, held there with the deliberate attention of a man who had said what he had to say and had returned to his own business, the small dignity of that refusal to watch her passage carrying its own clear message. She walked past Eleanor, who did look at her, whose eyes followed her the way the eyes of someone who had witnessed something followed the people responsible for what they had witnessed, not with cruelty, but with the particular quality of attention that said, "I see you. I have seen you. I will continue to see you," which was in its way harder to walk past than cruelty would have been. She walked past Brett, who had his eyes on the floor with the precise, studied concentration of a man who was going to be thinking about what he did and didn't do on this flight for a significant portion of the remainder of his professional life. She stopped in front of Naomi and Zoe. Up close, the mark on Zoe's cheek was still visible, not dramatically, not the angry red it had been immediately after the slap, but still present, still legible as what it was, still occupying the specific geography of Zoe's face where Diana's hand had connected with it, and Diana looked at it. She looked at it with the full attention of someone who had not until this moment allowed herself to look at the direct consequence of what she had done, and what crossed her face in that moment was complicated in a way that was genuinely hard to categorize. It was not simple guilt. It wasn't the clean, manageable emotion of someone who had made an error and recognized it. It was something more involuntary than that, something that arrived in the face before the mind had finished deciding whether to let it, something that looked in its flickering and unguarded form like recognition. The specific recognition of a person seeing the real size of something they had treated as small. She tried to begin the apology and stopped. She tried again. "What I said to you." She stopped again. Something in her throat was making this harder than she had expected, and she swallowed against it, and she looked at Zoe rather than Naomi, because something in her knew without being told that the apology belonged to Zoe first. "What I said to you was wrong. What I did was wrong. I'm sorry." Zoe received this. She didn't rush toward it or reject it, she did with it. What she did with everything new, which was to hold it at arm's length and look at it carefully, applying her internal criteria, deciding what it actually was and whether it was what it claimed to be. The consideration was genuine, not performed a 6-year-old processing an adult apology with the full seriousness of someone who had not yet learned to go through the social motions of accepting things she wasn't sure she had decided to accept yet. Then Zoe said the thing she said. "Did you know it was wrong when you did it?" The question moved through the cabin the way a stone moved through still water from the point of entry outward in circles, reaching every surface in the space before the ripples finally settled and the surface was still again, and nothing in the water was quite the same configuration it had been before the stone went in. Diana's mouth opened. It didn't produce anything for a moment, just the beginning of a breath. The start of a word that didn't fully form, and then it closed again, and something happened in her face that was visible to everyone in the cabin, and that no one, including Diana, could have prevented from being visible, because it was the kind of facial expression that happened below the level of management, in the territory where the face simply showed what it was dealing with before the person wearing it could decide whether to allow the showing. The facade cracked. Not dramatically. Not with collapse, just at one corner, just slightly. The way a surface cracked when the pressure behind it finally exceeded the capacity of the surface to hold it, and the crack was small, but it was real, and it was irreversible, because things that had cracked at the structural level were not the same as things that had never cracked, regardless of what you did to the surface afterward. She swallowed. "I think," she said, and stopped. "I think I wasn't thinking." Zoe looked at her steadily. "That's not really the same as not knowing," she said. 6 years old. She said it the way she said everything that was simply true to her without particular emphasis, without the editorializing that adults layered onto important statements, without any apparent awareness that she was saying something that the grown woman in front of her would find very difficult to set down once she had picked it up. She said it the way a child stated a fact about the world that the world had not yet taught her was supposed to be softened, and the absence of the softening was exactly what made it hit, the way it hit. Nobody spoke for a moment. Naomi put her hand on Zoe's knee, not to stop her, not to redirect her, not to manage the moment, but simply to be there to make the physical connection that said, "I am with you in this," without requiring any words that would have changed the quality of the silence. Then Naomi looked at Diana, and she held the look for a full 3 seconds before she spoke. And what she said quietly with the same careful precision she brought to everything that mattered. "I want you to remember this. Not the legal things. Not the business things, not what your father is going to arrange or not arrange. Those will happen the way those things happen, and we'll deal with them. What I want you to remember is what my daughter just said to you." She paused. "Because she is more right than you are going to be comfortable thinking about, and I think you already know that." Diana nodded. It was a small nod, and it was tight, and it was real. Not the performed acknowledgement of someone going through a required motion, but the actual physical expression of something being absorbed, and then she turned and she walked back to her seat and she sat down, and she put her hands in her lap, and she did not speak again, and something in the set of her posture was different from everything it had been before, as if some internal architecture that had been holding a particular shape for a very long time had finally and without ceremony let itself relax into a different one. Calvin watched her go. Then he turned back to Naomi. He sat down beside her. He took her hand in both of his, and he held it, and she felt in the grip of his hands the thing he had been holding together for the last 20 minutes, the controlled, compressed weight of a man who had moved very fast and very precisely through a serious situation and was now in the stillness after it, allowing himself to feel the full dimensions of what had prompted the movement, and she tightened her fingers around his and let him hold on. Brett moved down the aisle with his bags over one shoulder, and his eyes tracking a point approximately 18 inches in front of his feet, which was where eyes went when their owner was in the process of reckoning with something and hadn't finished and needed to get through the physical act of departing before the reckoning reached its conclusions. He paused when he reached Naomi's row. He stopped walking and looked at Zoe, and whatever he was going to say when he'd first stopped seemed to reorganize itself slightly once he was looking at her. Because Zoe was looking back at him with her characteristic front-on regard, and Admiral held against her chest, and her expression carrying the particular quality it carried when she was deciding what something was. "I'm sorry," Brett said, and his voice was rough and low and genuine in the way that voices were genuine when the speaker had stripped away everything practiced and was offering the uninsulated thing. "I'm sorry I didn't do more sooner." Naomi looked at him. He was young, early 30s, she thought maybe 29, with the tiredness of someone who had been running on nervous energy and managed proximity to someone else's decisions for too long. "Why didn't you?" she asked. Not accusatory, she said it the way she asked genuine questions with the flat, direct curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the actual answer. He looked at the floor between them. "I've been with her family for 5 years, he said. "I kept thinking someone else would handle it, that it wasn't my place, that I didn't have enough to that I couldn't." He stopped. "Nobody ever did. Handle it. Every time I waited for someone else to be the person who said something, there was no one." He paused again. "I was the someone and I didn't do it." "Now you know," Naomi said quietly. "Now you know to be the someone when it gets to that." He nodded. He moved toward the exit. He didn't look back, but his shoulders were different as he went. Not lighter, exactly, but reoriented, as if the weight had shifted from one distribution to another, and the new distribution, while not easier, was at least being carried honestly. Claire appeared at Naomi's elbow a few minutes later with a small bag from the galley, a juice box and a wrapped chocolate chip cookie, the kind that had been stocked for the flight in the small supply cabinet that Claire restocked before every charter and held it out without saying anything. And when Naomi looked at her in quiet surprise, Claire gave the smallest possible shrug. "She's had a long night," she said, nodding toward Zoe. And then, before she turned away, she said 2 more words, just 2 in a voice that carried considerably more weight than 2 words usually contained. "Thank you." A beat. For not letting it go. She moved back to her work before Naomi could respond back to the quiet, professional efficiency of a person who had witnessed everything that had happened on this flight, and who would carry all of it home with her tonight, and Naomi suspected for a significant number of nights after. Zoe had spotted the cookie with the unerring attention that 6-year-olds brought to the detection of treats, regardless of the emotional complexity of their current situation. Her eyes had gone wide, and she had straightened slightly, and she was looking at the bag with a focus that had entirely displaced whatever she had been feeling a moment before, because children were like this. They were marvelously and heartbreakingly like this. The capacity to move forward was not something they had to work for. It was simply how they were built. "Is that for me, for you, and for Admiral?" And "Admiral doesn't eat cookies," Zoe said, with the gentle patience of someone correcting a misapprehension. "But he appreciates the thought. He's very gracious about food offerings." For the first time since the slap, Naomi almost smiled. Outside, Calvin stood on the tarmac with his back to the plane and one hand in his pocket, and his phone to his ear, and his voice didn't carry through the aircraft door, but his posture did. And the posture was the posture of a man who was not the one explaining himself, who was the one receiving explanations and deciding with careful attention which of them were adequate and which were not. Zoe unwrapped the cookie and began eating it with both feet tucked under her, and Admiral arranged to her satisfaction, quiet and settled, and already at 6 years old, doing the thing that children did better than any adult she would ever meet moving forward. The diner was 3 blocks from the house in Los Angeles, and it was open all night, and the waffles were the kind that arrived with a small pitcher of warm maple syrup that you poured yourself, which Zoe considered to be one of the finest features of any food service establishment she had encountered in her 6 years of evaluating such things. And she was exercising this feature with the focused satisfaction of someone who had processed the events of the evening and arrived at the conclusion that a waffle was the appropriate response. It was nearly 1 a.m. Naomi sat across the table watching her daughter work methodically through the syrup distribution with Admiral propped against the napkin holder as a witness and a judge. And she felt the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating at a sustained level of controlled intensity for several hours, and was only now in the ordinariness of a diner at midnight beginning to feel the full weight of what the holding had cost her. Calvin had his coffee in both hands, and he was watching Zoe with the continuous quiet check-in that parents did after something had happened to their child. The monitoring that didn't stop just because the danger had passed, because the parental threat detection system, once activated, required time to return to its baseline, and the watching had a quality in it that Naomi recognized as the specific watching of a man who was also thinking about something he hadn't said yet. "She's fine," Naomi said. "I know. You've been looking at her like she's going to disappear." "I know that too." "Dad," Zoe said without looking up from her syrup work. "I can hear you. Both of you." "I know that as well," Calvin said, and something in his expression finally shifted by a fraction the first movement toward whatever was on the other side of the evening's wait. He set his coffee down. He looked at Naomi, and the way he looked at her told her that what was coming was not small, that it had been sitting in him for a while, and had been held by the practical demands of the last several hours, and was now in the relative quiet of a diner booth ready to be said. He told her about the meeting with Gerald Cole. 4 years ago, before they had moved to New York, before the Reed fleet had reached its current size, in a period when Calvin was building toward something that was not yet the thing it would become. He had been in conversation with a group of investors about a clean energy infrastructure fund. Right project, right time, right people, nearly. Gerald Cole had been one of the investors in the room. He had been courteous and professional through 2 weeks of meetings, and then, with no prior signal, he had pulled his commitment. He had taken 2 other investors with him when he left, and he had told the room on his way out that he had concerns about the character and judgment of the people running the fund. He was looking at me when he said it. Calvin said. He never said what he meant. He was too careful to say what he meant. But I knew what he meant, and everyone in that room knew what he meant, and he knew that we knew. And that was the point of it, that everyone could be in a room where something was said about a black man that couldn't be argued with because it had been said in a language he couldn't quote in court. The booth was quiet for a moment. Zoe had gone back to her waffle with the focused attention of someone who had determined that the adult conversation was not about her, and had therefore returned to her primary concern. "I never told you," Calvin said. "I handled it. The fund restructured, found different backing, eventually succeeded, and I told myself I had won the thing that needed winning, and there was no reason to carry it into everything else." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, but it never fully went away. It was there in every meeting, in every aircraft registration, in every contract negotiation where I walked in, and the room needed a moment to recalibrate. It was in the way I built things with a precision that was always partly about the building, and partly about building something so irrefutable that the Gerald Coles of the world couldn't say what they meant about it without everyone seeing exactly what they meant. He looked at Naomi steadily. "Tonight wasn't random. Diana didn't know who you were when she boarded. I don't think it was deliberate in that specific sense. But I know who raised her. I know what that family believes about people who look like us, and I know that what she felt on that plane, the certainty that there would be no consequence, that certainty came from somewhere. It was taught to her, by people who built it into the foundation of how she understood the world." Naomi absorbed this. The words landed differently than they would have 6 hours ago, before the slap, before the plane turning, before Zoe had asked a grown woman whether she had known they landed with the weight of something structural, something that explained the shape of things in a way that changed the dimensions of the evening without diminishing any of it. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I've already done some of it," he said. "The rest in the morning." Calvin's phone rang at 11:57, and the name on the screen was one he had known for 4 years and had expected with a certainty based on that knowledge to see at some point tonight, and the specific time of it, the particular choice of midnight rather than morning, told him something about Gerald Cole that he had already known, but that was being confirmed in real time that this was a man who called people at midnight, not because he was rattled, but because he had decided strategically that midnight was the hour at which his call would communicate the most about the relative positions of the parties. Calvin held the phone slightly away from his face for one moment. Then he picked up. Brooks Gerald Cole said the use of the surname alone without title or first name, the compressed assertion of a particular kind of authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it assumed its own legibility. "I hear we have a situation." "Your daughter struck mine," Calvin said. "On my aircraft." "Yes, I'd call that a situation." Gerald Cole's voice had the quality of very old expensive leather, smooth and dense, and carrying the particular texture of something that had been handled by many people over a long time, that had been shaped by use into something that communicated its age and its cost simply by existing. He was in his early 70s. He had spent those 70 years in rooms where his name was the first and last word, and his voice reflected the specific confidence of someone who had never once encountered a situation that his resources and his relationships could not in the end resolve in his favor. "Diana can be impulsive," Gerald said. "She gets it from her mother's side." The dismissiveness was so practiced it was almost elegant, the reflex of a man who had been excusing and managing this behavior for 30 years and had refined the excuses to their most efficient form. "I understand there was some kind of confrontation." "There was an assault on a 6-year-old, Calvin said. "On my aircraft, in front of 14 witnesses, including a flight attendant and at least 2 other passengers who have already spoken to me. I'd like you to use accurate language when you describe it." Gerald paused. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted by 1 degree, not off its foundation, nothing as dramatic as that. Just 1 degree in the direction of the tactical, the reorientation of a man who had begun to take the situation slightly more seriously than he had when he dialed the number. He used Calvin's first name. He framed what had happened as something that 2 men at the same level could address between themselves in the civilized and mutually convenient way that powerful people addressed things that had the potential to become inconvenient for both parties. "I think we both know that taking this further serves neither of us," Gerald said. "Jessica has already tendered an apology. These things happen. Calvin, and they're best resolved. Quietly," Calvin said. "Yes, I know how these things resolve. They resolve quietly when the person who was harmed doesn't have the means or the documentation or the support to make them louder. That's how it works, and we both know that too." He paused. "But I'd like you to think very carefully about whether those conditions apply here. Silence. A different kind of silence, the silence of a man recalculating, re-examining his assumptions about the terrain." Gerald's next question was direct in the way that questions were direct when the person asking them had already prepared a number in their head and was ready to deploy it. "What is it you want, Calvin?" "I want your daughter to understand what she did," Calvin said. "And I want to make certain she doesn't do it to someone else's child, someone who doesn't have a father whose name carries the weight mine does in the relevant circles. That's what I want." "That's very noble," Gerald said, and the word noble had something under it, something old and practiced and barely concealed a half-step below contempt, the particular condescension of a man who had spent a lifetime finding elegant ways to communicate that other people's moral positions were performances rather than convictions. "They resolve quietly," Calvin said, bringing it back when nobody has the means to make them louder. I'd like you to think about that sentence before your morning. A pause. The longest one yet. Something in it was different. Not quite the silence of a man whose position was shifting, not yet that, but the silence of a man who was beginning to see that the terrain he had been walking on was not the terrain he had assumed. I see, Gerald said. I don't think you do yet, Calvin said, but you will by morning. He ended the call. Naomi was looking at him across the diner table. Did you just hang up on Gerald Cole? I did, Calvin said and picked up his coffee. People don't hang up on Gerald Cole. People with something to lose don't, he said. Zoe was looking between them with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation for important information. Was that a bad man? Yes, Calvin said. Is he going to be in trouble? Calvin looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at Calvin. There was a full conversation in that look about what trouble meant when money could cushion it, about what justice meant when it was partial and imperfect and arrived late, about what you told a 6-year-old about a world that was not always fair, but that was on the right nights with the right people in the right place, something approaching just. His daughter, as Calvin said, and left it there. Zoe nodded with the same complete and unencumbered certainty she had brought to every judgment she had rendered tonight. Good, she said, and returned to her waffle. Naomi was not fully asleep. She hadn't been fully asleep since they'd gotten home. She had achieved something in the range of sleep, something with the approximate shape of it occupying the same hours and the same horizontal position. But without the full release that actual sleep required, without the capacity to stop the part of her mind that was still running the events of the evening in sequence, examining them from different angles, looking at the architecture of what had happened and what it meant and what needed to be done with it. She had carried Zoe in from the car, dead weight in her arms, the exquisite, familiar heaviness of a sleeping child. Admiral clutched under Zoe's chin, and her mouth slightly open, and her absolute unconsciousness a thing of grace, and had gotten her into bed without waking her, which was on the best of nights. A minor miracle, and on this particular night felt like something considerably larger. She had stood in the doorway of Zoe's room for a long time afterward in the dark, just listening to her breathe, doing the thing that parents did after the worst moments had passed. The thing that was both a check and a consolation, and a way of standing in the evidence that the worst was over. Calvin had come up behind her at some point and put both hands on her shoulders and stood with her without speaking, and they had stayed like that for a while, in the dark doorway. The particular silence of two people who had been through something together and didn't need to talk about it yet, who were just letting it be real in the shared space between them. Then they had gone to bed, and Calvin had slept the way he slept, quickly and completely, the sleep of someone whose relationship with rest was practical rather than anxious, and Naomi had lain beside him in something that approximated sleep and had thought about what she was going to do. Because she had known, somewhere over the descent back toward JFK, before the wheels touched the tarmac, before Calvin crossed it in 4 strides, before the apology and the question, and the small graces of Claire's cookie and Brett's honesty, she had known that the question of what to do with this was not going to be resolved by the plane turning around. The plane turning around was Calvin's response, immediate and concrete and necessary, and it was the response that the situation in the moment had required. But the larger question, what the record of this night looked like, who held it and how it was kept, and whether it existed in a form that could do something beyond the circle of the people who had been on that aircraft, that question had been forming in her since the moment she had heard the slap and understood what she was dealing with. At 4:47, her phone lit up. She reached for it without sitting up, the reflex of a person who had not been fully asleep anyway, and read the text message from a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Reed, my name is Diane Okafor. I was in row 7 on your flight tonight. I want you to know I have video. From the moment she shoved your daughter to the moment she sat down after the apology. I had my phone down in my lap, and the angle is slightly off, but the audio is completely clear. All of it. I didn't know what to do with it tonight. I think I know now. Please call me when you're ready. Naomi sat up in the dark. She read it twice, then 3 times. She set the phone on her knee and sat very still in the quiet bedroom while Calvin breathed slow and even beside her, and the house was entirely silent around her, and the city outside was doing what cities did at 4:47 in the morning, which was moving in its half-lit minimal way, a reduced version of itself waiting for the hours when it would expand again into full noise and full light. She thought about what a video meant not in Calvin's world, not in the world of charter company contracts and aviation networks and men whose names cleared corridors, where the evening's consequences were already being set in motion through channels that moved on their own logic. But in the other world, the larger and more unpredictable one, the one where a video of a grown woman's hand connecting with a 6-year-old's face and the specific words that followed it was simply and obviously what it was readable to anyone who watched it, regardless of whether they knew any of the names involved. Gerald Cole had called at midnight because he believed this was going to be managed quietly. He had believed it with the deep foundational confidence of a man for whom things had always been managed quietly, for whom the machinery of management was so familiar and so reliable that he had never seriously entertained the alternative. He had no idea what was coming. She thought about Zoe's question and about the look on Diana's face when she couldn't answer it. She thought about Brett saying nobody ever does, and she thought about Claire's 2 words, thank you. And she thought about Eleanor sitting in row 4 with her phone already running because something in her had known before any of it reached its worst point that this needed to be witnessed by someone who was going to do something with the witnessing. She picked the phone back up. She typed, "Thank you, Diane. I'll call you at 8. She put the phone on the nightstand and lay back down. She stared at the ceiling and she did not sleep, but the waiting had a shape to it now. Purposeful and directed and aimed at something specific, and that was different from the waiting that had preceded it. At 8:03 in the morning, Naomi was at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and her second cup of coffee going cold beside her because the first cup had also gone cold while she was writing, and she had reached the point in the morning's work where the coffee was secondary to the thinking, and the thinking was moving faster than her hand could keep pace with. She called Diane Okafor. Diane picked up on the second ring. Her voice warm and carrying the slight roughness of someone who had also not slept particularly well. The voice of a person who had been awake since some early hour, turning something over in their mind, deciding and undeciding and deciding again, which Naomi recognized, because she had spent the same hours doing the same thing. Diane was 53 years old. A pediatric nurse from Chicago. "That's why I was watching from the start," she said. "I'm a pediatric nurse. I notice things involving children before other people do," and she had been in row 7 on the right side, close enough to see everything, and far enough back that Diana had never once looked in her direction. When she shoved her, Diane said I already had my phone in my hand. I'd been watching for about 2 minutes before that. Something in how she was talking, something in the temperature of it. I just had a feeling. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just felt like somebody needed to be watching, and I was positioned to be the one who was watching. Naomi gripped her pen. "How much did you get?" "Everything from the shove," Diane said. "The words, the slap, your daughter's face, the apology and what she said during it. The audio on that is very clear, Mrs. Reed. Very clear. My phone was angled slightly off, so the video is not perfect framing, but you can see what you need to see and you can hear everything." There was a brief pause, and then Diane said something that Naomi filed away immediately in the place she kept things that mattered. "It's yours. I texted you instead of posting it or doing anything with it myself because it's your daughter, and this should be your decision. I'm not going to do anything with it that you haven't asked me to do." After they exchanged details and Diane sent the file, Naomi opened it at the kitchen table. Watching it was different from living it. And the difference was the specific difference between being inside an experience and being a witness to it. The distance produced its own terrible clarity. allowed her to see what she had not been able to see while she was managing herself and managing Zoe and calculating the trap and trying to hold everything together. She watched Diana's hand come back. She watched it connect. She watched Zoe's head snap sideways, and she heard in the clean, unmistakable audio of a phone held 2 rows away. The sound of it, and she made a sound in the quiet kitchen that she had not made on the plane, because on the plane she had not had the privacy for it. She watched Zoe lift her face and say the 4 words. She closed the video. She pressed her palms flat on the legal pad. She breathed once, twice the deliberate breaths of someone resetting from the inside out. When David came downstairs 20 minutes later and read her face without needing to ask any questions, she pressed play and let him watch. He watched without moving, once hands flat on the table, jaw-set eyes fixed and absolutely steady. He was the same Calvin she had watched cross a tarmac the night before. The same quality of controlled, directed attention, but what was in his eyes when the video ended was something that she understood fully and could not have described to anyone who hadn't earned the same understanding. "Who is she?" he said. "Diane Okafor, pediatric nurse from Chicago. She's giving us 24 hours. She doesn't have to. It's hers. She can do whatever she wants with it, but she's giving us the choice." Calvin looked at the phone on the table between them. "What do you want to do?" Naomi looked at her notes, 3 pages of the legal pad covered in the precise, compressed handwriting she used when her mind was moving faster than the pen, and she laid out what she was thinking, the way she laid out engineering problems clearly in order with the decision points identified and the relevant factors stated beside each one, without embellishment. 2 paths. The first, private pressure running through Calvin's network and the channels he had already activated overnight. The charter company CEO, who was an old friend and who had already been called. The Cole family's law firm, 2 of whose senior partners were in Calvin's investment network and who had been informed of the evening's events. The regulatory filings available through his attorneys, the civil options, the quiet and thorough and targeted consequences that could be arranged by a man with Calvin's resources and Calvin's relationships working through the infrastructure of a world that understood how these things were done. This path would cost Diana Cole professionally and cost Gerald Cole in the specific ways that cost him most in access in relationships in the currency of trust and alignment that his world ran on. It would hurt them, Naomi said, in the ways that hurt people like them. It would be real, and it would be lasting, and in 10 years you would still feel it in their operation. The second path go wider. Take the video. Take their names. Take the full story, including the history between Calvin and Gerald Cole, the investment meeting, the pulled commitment, the comment about character and judgment delivered to a room full of people while looking at a black man, and put all of it in a space where it belonged to everyone, where the Cole family's publicists and lawyers and damage control machinery could not reach it before it had already become something larger than any of their management tools could contain. Calvin said what needed to be said. If we go public, we lose control of how the story gets told. The narrative can be taken from us before we've finished giving it. I know that, Naomi said, and Zoe is the reason I'm considering it anyway. She leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table, the posture she used when something mattered enough to close the physical distance between herself and the person she was talking to. Calvin, that video shows a woman calling a 6-year-old black girl a filthy animal on a private aircraft. And then it shows that same little girl looking up through her tears and saying 4 words that turned the plane around. That story is not just ours. It belongs to every parent who has ever stood in a space where someone did something to their child that they were absolutely certain would have no consequence. She paused. I'm not trying to destroy Diana Cole. I genuinely don't care enough about Diana Cole to make her the point. The point is what she felt safe doing. The point is what convinced her from the moment she shoved Zoe in that aisle that there was no version of this with a real consequence. That conviction was built, it was put in her over years by people and structures and a lifetime of being extracted from accountability. And that's the story. That's what needs to be seen. Calvin was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet of a man who was not undecided, but who was doing the respect of genuine consideration rather than the performance of it. Then he said, "Give me 1 hour. There's someone I want to talk to before we decide." He called Walter Hayes, a man who had been in more versions of this situation than either of them, who had watched families navigate the choice between private resolution and public accountability for 20 years from a position that gave him an unusually clear view of both outcomes. Walter talked for 35 minutes, and when Calvin came back to the kitchen table, his face had the expression of someone who had received the information they needed and had incorporated it. He said, "Go public," Calvin said. He said the private path is worth running alongside it. But if the goal is what you said this morning, then the story needs to exist where money can't manage it. And he said the video changes everything. Without it, you have a story. With it, you have evidence. Evidence is harder to spin than a story. Naomi reached for her phone. While Calvin made his calls, Naomi sat with Zoe in the living room, and Zoe arrived at 9:15 with the elastic morning-specific resilience of a child whose body had decided entirely without consulting anyone that the night was over and the day was beginning, and that the appropriate response to the beginning of the day was to come downstairs and find out what was happening. She came down with Admiral under one arm and her hair in the magnificent multi-directional state that it achieved every morning without any apparent assistance from anything. And she climbed into Naomi's lap with the proprietorial ease of a 6-year-old who considered her mother's lap a standing reservation, requiring no advance notice, and she looked up at her and said, "What are we doing today? Dad and I have some things to take care of this morning," Naomi said. "Then whatever you want." Zoe considered this. "Admiral wants to see the aquarium," she said. "The seahorse exhibit specifically. He has a professional interest." "What kind of professional interest does Admiral have in seahorses?" Zoe looked at her with the patience of someone explaining something self-evident. "Elephants and seahorses have similar qualities of dignity," she said. "He finds them collegial." Naomi pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, and then, because she needed to know, and because Zoe would tell her the truth without managing it. "How does your face feel today, baby?" Zoe reached up and touched her own cheek lightly, the exploratory touch of someone assessing something from the outside. "A little itchy," she said. "Is that normal?" "That's totally normal," Naomi said. "That's just it getting better." She kept her voice even and filed the words "a little itchy" in the place she kept things she needed to feel later when she had the privacy to feel them without it affecting the room. Zoe was quiet for a moment, and then Mom. "Is that lady going to get in trouble?" Naomi chose her words with the care she always used when Zoe asked questions that deserved a real answer rather than a managed one. "I think she's going to have to answer for what she did." "Yes." "Good trouble or bad trouble?" Naomi paused. "What do you mean by that?" Zoe shrugged the particular shrug of a child who had not yet learned to dress up her thinking in adult-sized packaging before presenting it. Is she going to have to learn something, or is she just going to get in trouble and stay the same? Because if she just gets yelled at and nothing changes in her head, then she'll just be more careful next time. But if she has to actually learn it, she trailed off and shrugged again as if the conclusion were obvious. Naomi held her daughter a little tighter and thought about Gerald Cole's midnight phone call and the charter company CEO and the attorneys and the video and the journalist she was about to call, and she thought about what Zoe had just said, the 6-year-old's taxonomy of consequence. The distinction between punishment that was just pain and consequence that was understanding, and she thought about what she was trying to build with the decision she was making this morning, and whether it was the right kind of trouble. Calvin was in the doorway. He had been there long enough to have heard all of it. Both, hopefully, Naomi said. "I think it'll be both." "Okay," Zoe said, apparently satisfied with this answer, and wriggled down from Naomi's lap and went to find cereal with Admiral under her arm and her hair doing whatever it wanted. Naomi spoke to the journalist, a woman named Patricia Song, 12 years at a national outlet with a reputation for the specific quality of journalism that treated the people it covered as complicated human beings rather than story elements for 45 minutes. And she told the story the same way she had told it to Calvin on the phone at 30,000 feet, beginning to end. Facts in the order they occurred, precision, without embellishment. Trust in the facts to carry their own weight without requiring performance from the person delivering them. Patricia asked about Gerald Cole. Naomi told her what Calvin had told her the investment meeting, the pulled commitment, the comment about character and judgment delivered while looking at Calvin, and she said clearly that she was reporting what her husband had shared with her and not making independent claims about events she hadn't witnessed. Patricia asked about the video. Naomi said Diane Okafor would speak to her directly. "Why are you doing this?" Patricia asked toward the end of the call. "You have the resources to handle this another way. A lot of people in your position would take the settlement and the private apology and move on." Naomi thought about Zoe's question, good trouble or bad trouble, and about Brett saying that nobody ever did that. There was never a someone, that he had waited for 6 years for a someone who never arrived. "Because my daughter is going to grow up in a world where this keeps happening," she said. "I can't protect her from all of it, and I wouldn't want to, even if I could, because you can't build a child by making the world smaller around her. What I can do is make sure that when she's old enough to understand what happened on that plane, she can find a record that says her parents didn't manage it quietly, that says it was wrong out loud with her name attached to it. That's what I can do for her." The story ran the following morning at 6:47 a.m. By 8, it had 80,000 shares. By 9:30, Diane Okafor's video, clear audio, the full sequence from shove to apology to Zoe's 4 words, was the most watched item on every major platform. "Get out now, you filthy animal," followed by "My dad owns this plane," the two halves of the story in less than 30 seconds of video visible to anyone who wanted to see it. The Cole family's publicist issued a statement by 11 a.m. It used the word misunderstanding 4 times. It used the word regrettable twice. It noted that Diana Cole had already personally apologized to the family. It did not use the word assault. It did not include the words filthy animal. It did not mention that Diana Cole had struck a 6-year-old child. The internet noticed every single one of these omissions within approximately 4 minutes, and it did not let any of them go. Gerald Cole's press conference held that afternoon used the word everyone in the sentence about growth and reflection, a moment for everyone involved to reflect and grow, as if there were multiple parties to the question of who had put their hand across a child's face and called her an animal. And the internet noticed that too, and dissected it sentence by sentence for the remainder of the day. Calvin let Gerald's calls go to voicemail. He had been in back-to-back calls since 7 a.m. The calls he was taking were the ones that mattered, and they were not from Gerald Cole. Brett called Calvin's office at 11:30 in the morning. He had gotten the number from the business registry attached to the charter company. He explained somewhat haltingly, and he understood if no one wanted to take his call, and he said he had been up since the plane landed and he had something that needed to be said to someone in the Reed family directly. Calvin's assistant put him through. "I've been with the Cole family for 5 years, Brett said, and his voice had the quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, and was now discovering that the prepared version felt different in the actual saying of it. More weight to it, less efficiency. Each word taking slightly longer to get out than he had expected. In those 5 years, I saw things I should have reported and didn't. Not as bad as last night, but the direction of it, the pattern of it. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't have enough evidence, that the cost to me was too high." He stopped. "I want to give a formal statement to whoever is handling the legal side of this, and I have documentation of 3 separate incidents that I kept records of because something in me knew they needed to exist, but I never did anything with them." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "How old are you, Brett?" The question seemed to land sideways unexpected. 29. In 5 years, you kept documentation of incidents because something in you knew they needed to be documented. That something, that instinct to keep the record even when you didn't act on it, that was the person you're going to be for the rest of your career. It just needed a night like last night to get all the way out. Calvin paused. I'm going to give you the name of our attorney. You call her. Call Lee. Whatever it costs you professionally, I'll personally make sure it doesn't cost you more than you can absorb. Why would you do that? Brett said. I didn't do enough on the plane. I didn't. You told my wife to be the someone, Calvin said. She told me. That counts. And you're being the someone now. That's all any of us can do, be the someone when we actually get there. Brett's statement, when it was given and incorporated into the larger record, documented 4 years of incidents. 2 other former Cole family employees contacted him within the week after the story ran. Both had their own documentation, both had been waiting for someone to go first. And now there was a first, and they followed. Eleanor sent Naomi a handwritten note, not an email, actual paper, mailed from her hotel. 2 sentences. I've been watching situations like what happened on that plane my whole life. I'm glad that this time someone caught it on the way down. Naomi pinned it above her desk. Claire sent a text 3 weeks after the flight. No explanation attached, no context offered. I think about that night more than you know. Naomi read it twice and typed back. So do I. And then, thank you for what you did. Claire's response came 4 minutes later, and it was just, you didn't let it go. That made the difference. A congressional office called Calvin's Business Line the afternoon the story ran. A representative who had been working on legislation addressing discrimination in private transportation for 3 years had seen the video, and the office wanted to speak with the Reed family about whether they would be willing to be part of a conversation that had, until the morning of Diane Okafor's video, been unable to find the traction it needed. Diana Cole was in a hotel suite with the curtains drawn, and her legal team in the adjacent room, and her phone filled with notifications she had stopped opening, and her father's voice. She had heard it 7 times in the last 12 hours on voicemail messages she had listened to once, each and not returned, telling her what they were going to do next, how they were going to manage this, what the family's position was going to be, and how she needed to present herself in order to support that position. She was watching the video for the 5th time. Not because she wanted to. She had not wanted to watch it the first time and had not wanted to watch it any of the times since. But because she kept returning to a specific moment in it. A moment she needed to see again, each time she thought she had seen it enough, the moment that was not the slap, and was not the words, and was not any of the things the internet was focusing on. It was the moment when Zoe asked her question, and Diana's face didn't answer. In the video, you could see it clearly, the question arriving. Diana's mouth opening, and not producing anything. The silence of a woman who had known the answer and had no way to give it, and no version of not giving it, that was not itself a kind of answer. She was watching herself not answer. She was watching herself stand in the evidence of what she had been and what she had chosen. And she was watching it from the outside, and the outside view was something she had never had access to before, because you couldn't occupy both positions simultaneously. You couldn't be inside the certainty and outside it at the same time. She had been certain there would be no consequence. Foundationally, structurally certain, not as a thought, but as an assumption so deep it never needed to be examined, built into the foundation of how she understood the world, how she moved through it, what she expected from it. The certainty had been wrong, and knowing it had been wrong did not yet feel like a lesson, so much as it felt like the ground continuing to shift beneath her feet, soft and unreliable, in ways she did not know yet how to walk on. She closed the video. She put her phone face down. She sat in the dark and held for the first time in her life the weight of the question a 6-year-old had asked her and that she still did not have an answer for. 3 weeks later, Calvin and Naomi flew to Washington on a commercial flight, middle of the plane Zoe at the window and Admiral in the middle seat with a small safety belt that Zoe had fashioned from the spare paper in her backpack because Admiral had been on enough flights now to have opinions about proper restraint systems. Nobody on the plane looked at them sideways. Nobody said anything that required a response. The flight was entirely beautifully unremarkable, which was precisely what it should have been. Which was precisely what every flight should have been, and the ordinariness of it felt to Naomi like the most radical thing she had experienced in 3 weeks. The congressional meeting was 4 hours of real substantive work, Naomi laying out the timeline with the same precision she had used at 30,000 feet, then stepping back to let the people whose job it was to translate experience into legislation do their translation, contributing when the conversation reached the question of what the law needed to say and how it needed to say it. There was a moment toward the end of the second hour when Naomi said something that made the room go quiet. The standard is simple. No private ownership of any enclosed transportation space removes the protection of the people inside it. No family name, no account, balance, no history. The standard is you don't get to hit a child and call her an animal and call it a misunderstanding, because you can afford a better lawyer than her parents, and the congresswoman looked at her and said, "That's the language, that's the principle," and wrote it down. On the flight home somewhere over the dark, flat middle of the country, Zoe woke from sleep and looked out the window at the scattered lights below for a moment, and then she said with the particular conversational tone she used when she had been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a conclusion, "Mom, I want to be a judge." Naomi looked at her. "Since when?" "Since Washington," Zoe said. "The congresswoman's job is good, but I want to be the one who makes the rules that the lawyers use. I want to decide what the standard is." Calvin opened one eye. "She's going to be a judge. She's going to be whatever she decides to be," Naomi said, and she said it quietly and with absolute certainty, the same certainty she brought to the things she knew completely. "And the world is going to make room for it." Calvin closed his eye again. He was smiling. Naomi turned back to the window. Below them, the country moved beneath its darkness. All those lives and rooms and kitchens and children asleep in all those houses, and somewhere in all of it, the consequences of a single flight were still moving outward in their slow, unpredictable circles, touching things she would never see, reaching people she would never meet, doing what truths did when they finally got out into the air, which was travel further and faster than anyone had planned. The legislation moved out of committee 6 weeks after that flight with 3 co-sponsors who had been unreachable, suddenly returning calls. Diana Cole did not appear publicly for 2 months. Brett's statement, combined with the documentation from 2 other former Cole employees who had been waiting for someone to go first, became part of a legal file that the Cole family's team could not manage quietly because it was already part of the public record. Gerald Cole stopped calling. The charter company contract was not renewed. Diane Okafor went back to her patients in Chicago. Brett found work at a firm that did not require him to look at his knees. Eleanor's handwritten note stayed pinned above Naomi's desk through the summer and into the fall. The congressional bill passed its first committee vote on a Thursday morning, and Naomi found out about it from a text from the Congresswoman's chief of staff that said only first step, more to come. Thank you for not letting it go quiet. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she sat with it for a moment, and then she went to wake Zoe up for school. Zoe would not remember all the details of that flight. She was 6, and 6-year-olds did not carry the architecture of events the way adults did. They carried the feeling underneath the bone-deep understanding that arrived before language and stayed after the specifics had softened and faded. What Zoe would carry was this, that when someone came for her, her parents came back harder, that there was no altitude at which she was alone, that she was worth turning planes around for, and she would carry that understanding into every room she ever walked into. Every hard decision, every moment that cost something with Admiral in some form beside her, and the knowledge that some truths didn't need a title to matter. They just needed someone willing to say them clearly at exactly the right moment in a voice small enough to cut through everything.